They said it was just a series of tragic accidents. But I knew there was something more. Something sinister lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful hospital. A darkness that refused to be ignored. Part 1: Deadly Silence. The hospital air was heavy, heavier than ever. It felt like every breath carried the scent of despair and fear. The sound of my footsteps on the cold ceramic tiles of the hallway was the only noise breaking the deadly silence. I reached the psychiatric ward, where the ominous shadow of death loomed. In recent weeks, a wave of suicides had occurred in this ward, each more brutal than the last. The first time, a patient had thrown himself out of his room window. The second time, another patient had slit his wrists with a surgical blade. And now, the latest incident had happened last night. A young patient had tied a rope to the ceiling of his room and hanged himself. Dr. Filip, the senior psychiatrist of the ward, looked at me with concern. "These bizarre incidents are driving me crazy, officer. I can't find any logical explanation for them." I was just as puzzled as he was. I reviewed the patient's files. There were no common signs among them. Age, gender, illness, all different. It was as if an invisible force was pushing them towards this grim end. "Maybe it's just a series of random events," I tried to calm him. "Maybe. But there are too many of these coincidences. It's like someone is doing this. Someone who wants to drive us insane." At that moment, I looked up and around. The white walls, small windows, and empty beds all gave me a sense of suffocation. It felt like this hospital was a living entity that wanted to swallow us whole. "We need to do something, doctor. We can't just look at this situation like this." "I know. But where do we start?" As we left the ward, I looked at the cloudy sky. It felt like even the sky was sympathizing with us. Part 2: Shadows of the Past. Days passed, and the number of suicides continued to rise. The hospital's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. Patients and nurses were engulfed in fear and dread. Even as a police officer used to such incidents, I felt that something far beyond a series of simple suicides was at play in this hospital. Dr. Filip, with a pale face, said to me, "Officer, I've concluded that we need to delve into the past of this hospital. Perhaps the secret behind these events lies somewhere in the history of this building." I agreed with Dr. Filip's suggestion. We went to the hospital archive and spent hours poring over old records. In one of the files, we came across an unusual case. It was about an old doctor named Dr. Edward. About 100 years ago, he had been the chief physician of this hospital and was rumored to conduct strange experiments on patients. There were even whispers that he had a proclivity for Satanism. When Dr. Filip heard Dr. Edward's name, his face went ashen. "Dr. Edward? That name sounds familiar. My grandmother always referred to him as an evil being. She said he tortured his patients and turned them into hellish creatures." Armed with this new information, we headed towards the hospital's basement, where it was said Dr. Edward had his private laboratory. Upon opening the door, we were met with a strange sight. A dark, damp room lined with shelves filled with bottles containing strange colored liquids. On one of the lab tables, there was an old notebook, Dr. Edward's journal. Cautiously, I opened the journal. Dr. Edward's writings were filled with cryptic references and allusions to supernatural forces. He had written about trying to break the boundary between the human world and the spirit world to create new beings under his control. On one of the pages, we found a terrifying sketch. It was a drawing of a monstrous creature that bore a striking resemblance to a human. But its eyes were red and glowing, and its teeth were sharp and long. Part 3: The Awakening of the Devil. With trembling hands, I turned page after page of Dr. Edwards' journal. Each page revealed a darker secret than the last. In his experiments, he used a combination of chemicals and magic to create monstrous beings. These beings were tainted not only physically but also spiritually. Dr. Filip looked at me with wide eyes. My God! This is impossible. All these years, this secret remained hidden. Not only that, Doctor. It seems that these creatures are still here. I pointed to the sketch of the monster in the journal. This creature looks very much like the descriptions given by our patients before they committed suicide. A dark shadow, a terrifying being that approached them. At that moment, a weak groan came from outside the laboratory. We cautiously approached the door and opened it. In the hallway, we found a nurse lying on the floor, trembling violently. Her eyes were bulging out, and her skin had turned pale. Something grabbed me, she said with a trembling voice. Before we could do anything, the nurse fainted. With the help of some hospital staff, we took her to the emergency room. While the nurse was being revived, I looked around. I felt a demonic force prowling this hospital, a force that wanted to destroy us all. I told Dr. Filip, we need to destroy these creatures before they kill us all. Dr. Filip hesitated, but how? They are supernatural beings. We can't harm them with ordinary weapons. Maybe we can use the same thing that created them. I pointed to Dr. Edwards' journal. Perhaps by using the same formula, we can destroy them. We returned to the laboratory and began analyzing Dr. Edwards' formulas. We spent hours working until we finally came to a conclusion, a powerful chemical compound that could harm the monstrous beings. Part 4, The Nightmare Awakens. The chemical compound was ready. A thick, black liquid that smelled of sulfur and death. Carefully, we poured it into a glass container and headed to the hallway where the nurse had fainted. Seeing her now made our blood run cold. Her face had completely transformed. Her skin was ashen, her eyes were black and sunken, and black foam was coming out of her mouth. As soon as she saw us, the creature that was once a nurse growled in a guttural voice and charged at us. With unbelievable speed and agility, I hurled the glass container at her. The black liquid splashed onto her body, and with a loud scream, she collapsed to the ground. But it wasn't the end. Another creature emerged from the darkness, this one bigger and stronger. We looked at each other in terror. These creatures were far beyond our imagination. They were multiplying rapidly and had taken over the entire hospital. With each strike, they seemed to regenerate. At that moment, Dr. Filip shouted, "We can't hurt them like this. They are much stronger than us." I knew this too. These creatures were the product of Dr. Edwards' diabolical experiments, created for destruction. Suddenly, I remembered Dr. Edwards' journal. In one of the pages, he had written about using an ancient spell to control these creatures, a spell that could put them into a deep sleep. But to activate this spell, a sacrifice was needed. I told Dr. Filip, we need to use one of us as a sacrifice. Someone who can activate the spell. Dr. Filip looked at me in astonishment. Are you crazy? You can't use yourself or me as a sacrifice. We have no other choice. Either we do this, or we all die. With eyes closed, I approached the spell. I chanted the ancient words aloud. At that moment, I felt a powerful force surge through me. My body began to tremble, and my vision became blurry. Part 5, Awakening from the Nightmare? I struggled to open my eyes. Sunlight was shining on my face, making me blink. I looked around. It was a hospital room. White bed, pale walls, and medical devices. Everything seemed normal. It was as if all the events of the previous night had been nothing but a terrifying nightmare. Cautiously, I got out of bed and walked to the window. I looked outside. The sky was clear and blue, and birds were flying. The hospital was calm and quiet. It seemed like nothing unusual had happened. I went to the door of the room and opened it. The hallway was empty. Slowly, I walked towards the nurses' station. Everything seemed to be in its place. The nurses were going about their daily tasks. I spoke to one of the nurses and asked about the events of the previous night. She looked at me in surprise and said, "Nothing special happened, officer. Everything was normal." I went to the room where we had conducted the experiments. The glass container with the black liquid was still on the table. I picked it up and stared at it. Had it all been an illusion? Or had it really happened? With hesitation, I went to Dr. Filip's office. His journal was on the desk. I opened it and looked at the last page. The final thing he had written was, "Freedom is near. We will win." My mind was spinning from all these events. Was Dr. Filip still alive? Had he succeeded in controlling these creatures? Or was this all a complex game? I left the hospital and took a deep breath of fresh air. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't escape. As I walked home, I thought about everything that had happened. Was this the end of the story? Or was this just the beginning of a bigger nightmare?